Your host, Damian Pardo, and today we're going to be talking about transgender issues, trans rights, and Jessica Lamb has joined us, who I think is probably one of the best educators on transgender issues.
Thank you so much for saying that.
I mean, I always say humanity is one of the most important qualities, and you have it all over the place.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled, first of all, that you're here with us today, but I also would like to start with your personal story, a little bit of it.
Sure. Well, Jessica Lamb, born and raised in Miami, Florida. Went to school, same school with you, Damien. So we were classmates back in the 1980s.
Yes,
the Anita Bryant days,
the Anita
right?
Bryant years.
And but back then, we couldn't be out and proud. So I was very much in the closet in the 80s, and in the 90s, I had a little more courage. I realized that my life was just not going to be okay if I didn't express myself fully.
But what were you feeling like in those years?
I'm a transgender woman, by the way, guys. So, if I didn't make that clear at first. So I did have male designation at birth. And I did have feelings at a young age that I was different, that there was something other about me. I identified more with female identity, but being raised in a very Latino Cuban family, that was not the sort of thing that we could really talk about. So I hid it very well during those times, and my parents always thought I was gay. Turns out they were right, just not the gay they thought I was. I was never a homosexual man. I was a lesbian woman trapped in a boy's body, essentially.
Jessica, what we just said right now is so confusing to the majority of the population. And we were just talking briefly before the show, but that's one of the challenges with this issue.
Yeah,
that's why it's easy fodder for politics in general, because there's such a lack of understanding. Could you kind of walk that slower in terms of how you were feeling at the time, how gender is different than sexual orientation, than who you might love?
Yeah,
versus...
so part of what I do when I educate, there's the 4 components of sexuality, right? So there's your gender marker at birth. Now, did you get a chance to choose your gender on your birth certificate? Who decided that for you? A doctor, basically. And how did the doctor decide this? Did they do a DNA test on you or anything? No, most of the times they're looking at what genitalia is. The only thing genitalia tells you is what part of the reproductive process you're going to play. That doesn't talk about gender identity. Gender identity happens here in the brain. This is who I think myself to be. This is who I am. This is the drive that we have in our lives to be who we are. That question that everybody asks, who am I, comes from here. The passion we feel comes from heart. Who we're attracted to, that's different. How we express ourselves.
And that's very difficult for people to understand.
It is. It's very understanding. Most people would say transgender people are people who are really, really gay, so gay that they want to be the other sex. It has nothing to do with that. Yeah. So take away your penis. Does that change who you're going to? I'm sorry if I said a bad word.
No, please.
But but to take that away, that doesn't change who you're attracted to. If you were a veteran, let's say you went to war, and thank you for your service, but you had an accident, you stepped on an IUD, you lost the ability to have an erection, maybe it blew your bottoms off. Does that change you? You're no longer a man because you don't have a penis anymore? Or, if you're a man who has prostate cancer and you had to, remove, your testicles, does that make you any less of a man?
I think the challenge is because when you're not the other, meaning when you're just everything's aligned, you don't think about it.
Right.
So the idea that you could have an expression of a gender that's different than your emotion or than what's happening mentally is very foreign to the majority of people.
The easiest way to explain that is that if tomorrow you woke up and what was in between your legs the night before is different. Let's say you went to bed with a vagina last night and tomorrow you woke up with a penis and you look at it and it's like, what the heck did that get there from? Does that change who you are in that moment? It makes you wonder, why is this there? How did this happen? You might want to use it. It might be fun to use, but then it doesn't change you. Your body's changed, and now you are having a dysphoria about it, And that's the thing. It's no different than any person. Again, like I was saying, who am I? That's a very important question. And if you're a human anywhere on this planet, you come to that place where it's like, well, who am I? How you define that, that's what makes you different. The fact of the matter is if I cloned you, or if you cloned me, Jessica, do you get another Jessica? No, actually, you'd get a Jesus if you cloned me. And whether that Jesus is transgender or not, that's his life to live. that makes me unique. That makes you unique. That makes you different. That means you'll never exist ever again out of this space-time continuum, if
Yeah.
you want to look at it that way.
And like with anyone that's different, whether it's different because you immigrated here or it's different because of the color of your skin or your religious affiliation, you're in the out group. And there's a big, large number of people that are the majority that are in the in group. And so when issues aren't understood by the majority of people,
Well, that's the whole us versus them mentality. We're all, the man's out to get me, the us versus them. And then, this is how we don't get to, when we can't understand what the other person is going through, there's no way we can fathom. I can tell you, Damian, I'm having a hard time in my life right now, and it's really difficult, How would you understand what I'm really going through? You can sympathize with me, or you might even empathize because maybe you've gone through something. I think empathy is much greater than sympathy because it means I've kind of gone through something like that and I can understand that. I think anybody can reach that point where, I'm a parent, I've got a child, I care about my child, they have an issue they're struggling with. I love my child, I want to do the best I can for this child. I don't understand what they're going through, and it's about that understanding. But when we come from an us versus them, this is all that's happening, bloody knuckles. And until one person, like a palm tree in a hurricane that kind of sways, right? What was that I was watching when the hurricane was coming through Fort Myers this past year, how the waters were rising and how buildings were collapsing, and those palm trees that were just planted were just still standing there. The sun came out and there was the palm trees with all this devastation around them. Why? Because they sway. And I think that when we're going like this, somebody has to sway. And if we can go like this, at some point this person might sway, and then what we're doing is we might be applauding each other. But that's fine, we're applauding each other. Where we want to get is this, where we're going to actually connect with one another. And until we can connect with one another with empathy, with concern, with, listen, you have your views, I have my views, and that's okay. We can still coexist in this space. You believe in what you believe in, as long as what you believe in does no harm to yourself or to others, then who am I to say that that's wrong?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's not the way our political system works.
It's so polarized right now. It's so sad.
Correct. It's all based on polarization. It's also based on, the red team and the blue team, and rally your base and get more money, get more voters, get more people to do canvassing.
And isn't it always all about money sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely it is. But, my concern has always been for the transgender community, a community I've always held very close to my heart.
And very marginalized,
and very marginalized, and have been outspoken when the words weren't even commonplace within the LGBTQ community, when there was no T. Let's put it that way. And I feel like in many ways the trans community is being held out as the bait in a lot of this.
We're the worm on the hook, essentially. So yes,
we're the worm on the hook because
that's the one that's getting bait, and we're the ones that are getting hurt.
Yeah,
so.
and it's easy to understand why, because there's a whole lot of people who don't have any education around this issue. So it's easy to get them to go places mentally that an educated person around this, either because they had a family member or they spoke to someone or they were willing to listen to what was involved, they won't go down that road. But that's the majority of the population haven't had that experience.
Yeah, there was a pastor lady I once knew who was very adamant against the transgender community. Did everything behind the pulpit, on the radio, on the TV, that it was blasphemy, that the demons, that we need to lay hands on them, and that everything negative that you are hearing about the trans community was coming out of this woman's mouth, essentially, until one day her son comes out and says, "Mom, I'm transgender and I want to be a woman." And mom her whole faith was shaken at this point. So what do? Do I, kick my son out of the house? Do I, rebuke him in Jesus' name? And, but I love my son. What am I going to do? So it happened to her. And now she's like, if God doesn't make mistakes, then why did he make my son feel this way? Why is my son feeling this way? I mean, I certainly didn't raise my son to be this way. I raised him in a devout Christian home with my values and blah, blah, blah. Yet he still has these feelings, and it caused her. And to me, she's a superhero because, she had no control over what her son's decisions were, but she chose to love her child. And I think God would do the same thing, right? I mean, God sent, if you want to go Christian belief, sent Jesus to, take our sins away or whatever. But she found it in her heart to love her child, and later came out and apologized for all the harm she'd done in the community. So until it really happens to you and you really can empathize and really feel that struggle, you won't know. And in the end, she's like, well, if God doesn't make mistakes, then my son is not a mistake.
Mhm.
And I'm going to love my daughter, in the best way I can now. And so, I think that's incredible that when somebody can do something like
It
that.
strikes me too that it's a lifelong relationship. You were just talking a little bit about your relationship with your mom before we started
Yeah.
the show, and how that frustration always continues to some degree.
Yeah, it's underlying there in the conversation I was having with my mom earlier today. You know, um, One of the best gifts that 2020 gave me, and actually it was a gift that my father gave me, and that was home videos. My dad was one of these mans or men, I said mans, that was wrong English. One of these men typical Cuban man, very proud man, but he loved electronics, loved Star Trek, and
I'll
he
join
would,
them.
yes, and he would whip out the video camera. If there was a Thanksgiving or vacation, the camera would come out. So the unique thing is this is 1978, 79. I have videos of me before puberty, and I was able to kind of binge watch my life through 2020
Wow.
because I was digitizing the videotapes onto electronic media. And so as I was watching these videos, what I found really compelling was that I knew the struggle I was going through, and I could see in those videos just the darkness I was feeling, the cloud that was following me around. I was a teenager, and my body at this point was betraying me, and because of course, I wanted to be developing as a girl and not as a boy. Yet I was not communicating this to my parents because I couldn't. This was not the society I was living in the 1980s, and there I was on Christmas with my siblings, and my siblings kept coming over to me wanting to, oh, did you see what I got for Christmas? And then with smiles, and here I am just forlorn and just sad and upset. And I was like, and I'm looking through the camera and I'm going, wake up, your family wants you there. They love you. I know you're struggling, but come on, there's happiness happening around you. And I really felt for myself, for screaming into the TV set, tears rolling down my face at this point, realizing, they didn't know what I was going through, but I wasn't willing to tell them because during that time I couldn't. It was not anything we could talk about. We can talk about it today.
Yeah.
When I couldn't talk about it back then. And we talk about it today, and there's still great fear that, we're going to be persecuted against.
And I think one of the messages you were saying a little bit before was how important it is for young folks who may be going through that now, that we're never going to go through that again. The 80s, like what you went through.
What I've been saying basically is if I could survive the 80s and 90s, and let's look in the 90s, right, when we started to get some representation in media. We had the movie Boys Don't Cry. We had another movie, Soldier's Girl. We had movies that were really compelling movies about this topic, and they were always so tragic, but it created some awareness, and people were becoming more aware of this. And this is where I started to come in with the educational piece back in 1998, 99. I started to, go to University of Miami. I sit down in panels. I would share my story. My dear friend, Dr. Marilyn Volker, gave me an opportunity to be able to share those stories in classrooms. And from there, it just kind of took off. 2007, I was on a show with Larry King, and that was an amazing experience for me. And the thing that struck Larry King the most during our presentation, because up to that point in time in 2007, when I was invited to be on his program, all you'd really see were the horror stories, the murders, the this, the other, and that they were complicated people, and just, but he would talk to me and he was like, and what about your family? And my family are still in my life. I thank God for my family, because even though they don't necessarily agree with the choices I have made in my own life, when they said they love me unconditionally, they did. And so they saw me through that. Not that my family's going to fly pride flags in their house today, but they love me, and I'm still a part of their lives. And Larry King's producers were like, how's that possible? I didn't have, so the story they wanted to share with me, because they brought my kids, and my kids were normal teenagers, and I was raising them like any normal teenager would. And what fascinated them was that there was not that drama. Yes, there were pieces in my life that I had to deal with, like with school and when my kids classmates found out I was transgender and the struggles they went through. And so, yeah, I mean, not everything was, like Larry King said, hunky dory.
Yeah.
But we were working through those struggles in a very constructive and positive way.
Yeah.
And that's what brought me. So that in 2007 brought me in a place where it's like, you know what? I need to educate about these things. And
I
that's
also
when we
think
did
in
the
Hispanic
TransCon.
families in general, and Hispanic families, it's very hard to let go. Parents don't usually let go of their children like that.
No.
So I think that's.
It's hard. My mom used to describe it to me as a dark cloud that followed me my whole life.
Oh,
She
wow.
was like, there's a black cloud that she said it on a television interview that my whole life that was this happy kid. I was one that never got sick. I was one that got great grades, and I had friends, and I loved Fonzie and I loved Captain Kirk, and and I was into all the boy things too. But there was always something like an underlying sadness that she saw there. In spite of everything.
How did that feel to you?
know.
That underlying sadness. I mean, you probably didn't have words for it.
I had the words for it.
You did.
And that was my gender identity. I just didn't know how to express those. Those words were in here somewhere.
Wow.
And I just didn't know. I knew that, I always describe it as a movie reel, right? And so, and I also kind of describe it as maybe how a person who suffers with alcoholism might. Because it's like that thing in the brain always going, oh, I have to have that drink. If I don't have that drink, my life is, I needed to de-stress. I need, there's that thing that's always pulling you to that drink, right? That's how the alcoholic's life is like. For me, that pull was, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl. It was always up there in my brain, just swirling around. I didn't know how to deal with that situation except in private. I couldn't express it. I couldn't share it with my family. And when I did, when I was 13 years old, my mom said, well, I had a son and not a daughter. And she told me that I needed to stop thinking those thoughts, that, was not right, and that people would not be okay with me, and that I could, people might want to hurt me. And, at that point, I thought to myself, well, as a kid, 14 years old, like, well, then my mom doesn't love me, she doesn't care about me, she doesn't see me.
She was just trying to protect you.
She was just trying to protect me. But now as an adult, I can look at that and see that and say, you know what? She didn't know any better. She was doing the best she could with the information she had in the moment. That's why today, parents of trans kids going, I want my kid alive, not dead, because half of these kids will attempt suicide when they don't get the affirmation they need in their lives, and so this is the hope I like to try to bring to today's generation, is if I could survive the 80s and 90s, then we can survive now. We just need to rally, and we need to, believe in our political systems and rally behind the things that we want to support and want to be, because, there's other sides that are doing that and who are passing legislation, against our community, but that's what they believe in. They have every right to believe in all those things.
Right.
They might change their minds if, something happens in their lives that maybe say, well, maybe I did wrong. The point is you have to be willing to accept that, that we could be wrong.
Everybody evolves. I love that word. They say it a lot. Like they say, oh, Obama evolved or Bush evolved on this issue. And that means that you're open to listening and taking in different perspectives.
Those are my superheroes. The ones who are willing to actually listen and say, listen, I don't really relate with you with this, but I'm going to respect it. And I'm gonna affirm that with you. If I tell you my pronouns are she and hers, and you start to use that with me, thank you so much. You can use he pronouns with me all you want, make you look foolish, and I might be like, okay, fine. I know who I am. But for people who are just coming out of the gate with this and coming to terms with their own gender identity, that's a difficult thing to hear, because all humans on this world want people to love them. We want companionship. We want love. We want people to see us, to love us. That's just basic human nature, We all want to be accepted in one shape, way, form, or another. So, why are we pushing these people away and putting them into a box and trying to criminalize them? When all they're trying to be is who they are. They're not hurting you or anybody else.
Right. I want to pivot because I already know we're never going to have enough time to talk about everything that we want to talk about. But I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the Florida legislations that are currently in process and how, as a transgender person, you see them affecting the community.
Absolutely. There's hopelessness. I'm already starting to see people taking their own lives over it.
You have?
Yes. I've had at least 3 trans people that used to go to my support groups when I was working as the program coordinator at Pride Lines, who have taken their own lives because of these things. Some parents who I've been wanting to have them on panels to talk about their hurt, who just can't bring themselves to sit on a panel to talk about it because there is a lot of hurt around it. Things that they cannot control. They try, but we're the minority. And so as a minority, we continue to be oppressed because we don't have the majority, here. And so,
Well, it strikes me that from a political perspective, that's a completely different world. All the humanity you're sharing right now has nothing to do with politics.
that's
Sadly.
it seems. It seems so.
Sadly. And if I break down, mentally, like what's called the Parental Rights Bill or the Don't Say Gay Bill, when I break that down,
Which incidentally doesn't say anything about "Don't Say Gay" in that bill.
right,
Right, and so
right.
it's now called that, and it'll forever be known that as that
Exactly.
now.
Exactly.
But when the bill was first presented, on its face, it seemed like a great bill.
Yeah.
Until you read the fine print.
Right.
And
Explain
now that
print.
fine print is being exploited. Where
Explain
you
the
can't bring
fine
that,
print.
where you can't teach kids, before the third grade level, anything about gay or lesbian or transgender or any of these sort of things. Forget the fact that we've got parents who are gay, who have children in schools, and when they're ready to share their stories about their summer vacations, about my two dads or my two moms, can't share those stories because we can't say that, and that's protecting.
Well, and then this is so I'm going to share with you what I hear in the world,
Yeah.
right, from different sides. One group says that's not true. Teachers can go ahead and talk about all that. It just
Bottom line,
can't.
it was never part of the curriculum to begin with.
Well,
so.
but it just can't be in the curriculum. So teachers can still have the conversations. They can still, and the parental concern for, I guess, the parents that just don't know a lot about the bill
Teachers
is
are
I
afraid
don't.
for their jobs. So why they make barely any money
Yeah, I
to
know.
begin with, and basically they're your children's babysitters. But you've put handcuffs on them, because I can lose
I've
my
often
job.
said this should be the teachers' bill, protection bill,
You know?
because it really puts teachers in a bad position. But the average parent out there is thinking, you know what? I don't want government or the school system talking to my kids about these issues. Which, to a reasonable person, you hear that and you're like, okay, well, I can see a parent.
So when I was going to school, they weren't allowed to teach me about sex, and it was only in 5th grade that my parents had to sign a permission slip. But I knew about stuff before they signed that permission slip.
Of course.
Kids know, kids see it. And so it's out there now.
Right. But even though it might be an illusion, that parent wants to maintain that illusion and maintain the control over, even though they don't have it.
Well, that bill was a gateway to further legislation that is now being passed. So 3rd grade is being bumped up to
seniors.
Yeah. Now. So we can't even, our GSAs, which was a lifeline to many of these kids in schools, because, they might have been bullied.
Explain what a GSA is. A gay straight alliance?
A gay straight alliance in their schools. Something my kids didn't have, which they might have appreciated. Now, my kids had something similar, because there was a time where there was a kid in the school who found out that I was transgender because they did a Google search, and because I was already educating on this, there was a page out there talking about, and so they connected my last name Lamb with the kids in the school, and all of a sudden my kids were being bullied in school and being targeted as being transgender and gay themselves. They're heteronormative young kids. I mean, they explored a little bit, but what kid doesn't? But the bottom line is, those, they didn't ask to be put in this pigeonhole. So I had my kid in the guidance counselor's office. I had a phone call from the guidance counselor at work saying, your kid's having a panic attack because there's a kid's going to bully them thinking that he's transgender and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what do you need me to do? I can come in, I can educate, blah, blah. I was like ready to put on the armor and head in there and teach the students or the teachers or whoever needed to be educated around these topics. And the guidance counselor, well, we're going to leave it alone for now. It's just gossip. Let's make sure he calms down. But then I was proactive, and I was like, well, we need to have, and at the time we had, God bless their souls, trust counselors, which we don't have enough of anymore. A trust counselor in the school came to me, and I was like, listen, is there a safe space we can create for my children, in the school? Because they're only a year apart, so they were in the same school together. And like, yeah. So they started, and my son came up with this idea. It was a gay straight alliance, essentially. But it was a children of divorced parents group. And so
Support group.
his thought was like, who doesn't have divorced parents? So it
Smart.
was like code name GSA.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and it was in this GSA that they started that the kid who was spreading the rumors came out as transgender herself at that point.
Wow.
You know, it's like I was just trying to deflect to other people from bullying me, and I was targeting and asked for forgiveness and everything for my kids. And oh, I can tell you stories about what happened with this young person, because this person ended up in one of my support groups later on in life, and the amazing story that she had is a wonderful one, but a tragic one, but a one that ended, very well. But
So
yeah,
another thing I wanted to bring up was the bill that's out there now about hormone blockers and restricting those for minors.
they make it all about surgeries, preventing these kids from having surgeries that are not having surgeries.
Right.
And really the hormone, we've been prescribing hormones to kids for a long time. Case in point, when I was, going through puberty, I was a late bloomer. Kids were getting taller, the boys were getting facial hair, and I was still looked like a little boy, in junior high. And so, unbeknownst to me, the pediatrician at that time, the protocols were to boost it with some testosterone. So I was getting shots in my leg at the pediatrician's office. I remember how, him doing it, and I was thinking they were booster shots of some sort. Later in life, I was like, holy mackerel, they were giving me testosterone to kind of kickstart my puberty somehow. So we've been giving hormones to kids since the 1980s, at least in my thing, but I know it's been happening. Really what these hormones are doing is allowing kids the opportunity to delay that puberty, okay, because we're looking at hormone blockers, and for them to make those choices. Again, there are some irreversible effects from taking these things, but the alternative is some of these kids developing complexes over time, identity issues, self-esteem issues, and they struggle through it. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that since the age of 4, I knew there was something different about me, that my body was different. To say that our brains are not wired a little different, there were studies in the 60s and 70s that showed in mortem brains of people who were gender variant at the time, their brains resembled closer to the gender they desired to be or they felt themselves to be, rather than what, so science is even showing us. And there's always that, nurture versus, nature sort of situation. There could be a combination of both that is happening here. DNA is so complex, and we're only starting to uncover it.
We don't know enough about any of it.
That who's to say that something encoded in that DNA is there? Another case in point, my mother grew up with a father who wasn't her biological father. She didn't know this until she was an adult in life. We found her biological father in Cuba. We went to go visit him in Cuba and everything, and we were sitting there, and her biological father, was talking about, how his grandson was also transgender. And my mom looks at me, he's like, that's my dad. It has to be. How is that coincidence that, there's, and so that made us think that maybe there's something in that DNA, Now at this point, this grandson, I think, is a drag queen, and he didn't desire to go through any gender reassignment surgeries or gender affirmation surgeries, like we like to say now. But it's really interesting that DNA is so complex. So who's to say that maybe this is, God made me this way? Maybe that's what happened. God made me this way.
So when you
for a
think
reason.
about public policy, it always blows my mind that we can't find a middle ground where, there could be more control around the issue, but in a supportive way that helps people thrive.
Right.
And
Listen,
this bill isn't meant for that.
Yeah, I'm all for, providing those guidelines, right? You can't let your kids have free reign. You can't tell your kids, it's okay to jump on the bed, because, if they jump on the bed, they're going to fall on the nightstand and break their head. Right. 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed, what happens? The doctor tells them to stop jumping on the bed. But, yeah, that's the thing, is that you provide those guidelines, but, you don't stop it. You don't, at this point, I know doctors who have been working with gender diverse kids, and the terminology we use today now is called gender diverse. When we're talking about kids, we're using gender expansive or gender expansiveness. But these gender diverse kids, and because of the laws that have been recently passed in the state of Florida, can no longer practice with these children, putting these kids in a very harmful situation. Some of these parents are leaving the state of Florida to go into another state to get the medical health care that they need, that their child deserves to have. And again, we're not looking to give them surgeries. That's for them to decide later in life. What we're trying to do is buy them time and to give them good mental health to get through this.
So I want to share another perspective that I've often heard, which is, you know, I don't know what I would have been if I had been told about these options at an early age. So I want you to comment on this. Well, when I was younger, I was effeminate. I liked this and this and this, and I liked not being forced into anything or talked about anything, so that I could find my own road to whatever I was going to be as an adult. And so, what would you add to those kind of perspectives when people say, "I would rather not have those conversations for my children or their friends, so that they can just figure out their road as they evolve"?
The bottom line is, though, is that when a kid wants to learn something, if they don't learn it from you, they're going to learn it from somewhere else. You know, when you think about sex education and the fight that we had in the 70s to try to bring it into in the school curriculums, you know, not at the toddler age, you know, not at you know,
What age
grammar
does it
school
start?
age,
What
you
age
know,
does it start?
when puberty starts, essentially. But you
So
know,
fifth grade,
this
or?
you know, fifth grade. Gender identity, however, that starts at a young age. That starts about 3 or 4. At the age of 3 or 4, you already have a sense of your gender. You realize your body is different than somebody else. You start to have feelings about your gender at that point. You still don't know who you're attracted to at this point. Some kids might have an inkling, you know, around 7 or 8, oh, I like boys or I like girls. Most of the times they're picking up from social cues. Other times it's just, I feel different and I don't like this and I see this on there and I don't really identify it. So I do, you know, sometimes it's that inkling and a lot of times that's coming from social cues. But that sense of gender identity, that is core. That is something that starts to develop at a very, very young age. And so you have kids, when they are suffering with gender dysphoria, will tell you, I am a boy. Or they can tell you, I'm not a boy. Most of the time, they're going to tell you what they're not first, you know, before they can tell you what they are. You know, and so that is the important thing to think about in the development of kids. Where you start to really find sexual attraction is right around that puberty time, because right before then everybody's got cooties, you know. And so, you know, that happens around 5th, 6th grade. That's when puberty starts to kick in, and that's when, like, oh, all of a sudden this looks different to me, you know. And that's just human nature developing, you know, the way it is. Again, probably encoded in your DNA somewhere, you know.
And Jessica, what do you think, right now that we're so polarized and these conversations are coming up pretty ugly on both sides, and apparently this is a hot topic that's going to go national because it works. You know, it basically brings in money, it creates, you know, all this at the expense of trans people, but it works. How can you help people have this conversation? How can you help them have it be non-polarized?
I had mentioned earlier, until you can empathize with the other person, you know, it brings up a situation that happened to me when I was educating at St. Thomas University in front of some seminary students, and I had one student come approach me after the class and said to me, Jessica, you seem to be like a lovely person. You had such I see that you had so much struggle when you were growing up, and you have family that loves you now. That's great, but you know that you're going to hell for being who you are right now. You need to find Jesus to take that away. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, you know, I think God loves me who I am, you know, and any person would want to defend themselves at that point and say, you know, no, I'm not going to hell,
Sure.
you know. But in that moment, I realized, you know something? Thank you. I appreciate you letting me know that I'm going to hell, because very likely that's where I'm going. You know, I know this is what you believe in, you know, but that's my problem with God. Let me deal with God. Right now, you and I are here, you know, let's just try to get along with one another. You have your relationship with God, I'll have mine, and we can just coexist in this moment, you know. Because the bottom line is, though, is there was no way I was going to convince her otherwise. She has her beliefs. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I cannot change her, you know, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So, and to know that I have a point of view and she has a point of view, until she can see my point of view, and she'll never see my point of view because she's not me, you know, until something happens in her life where she can empathize with what I'm going through, then we're going to continue to hit. So I decided to be the one to sway in that moment and say, you know, thank you for letting me know, because you know what?
Yeah,
It
you
took
did
a lot
that.
of courage from her in that moment in time. I recognized the fact that it took courage from her to come up to me and say that to me, you know, that I was going to hell. The audacity that she had, the courage to say that to me, took courage. It did. And I acknowledged that. And she was coming from a good place in her own heart, you know. And so I need to understand that as well. Because if I want understanding, I need to find understanding. And where does that happen? Going back to that serenity prayer, is I can't control what's going on around here, but I can control how I govern myself and how I decide to react or respond to something. So if I want that from someone, I have to be willing to give that to someone.
It's beautiful because you were honoring the intentions, not necessarily the words,
Correct.
which is very, very hard to do.
Correct.
And I think our biggest enemy here is fear.
Yeah.
When people don't know, when they haven't had these experiences, they haven't even been given an opportunity to empathize, all they have is fear.
Yeah.
And that's what creates violence and attacks and judgments and all the rest of that stuff.
Yeah. Everybody's going through something, and everybody feels that they're right or wrong, or but you have the right to feel that. That's what human rights are all about. So your skin is different color than mine. That doesn't mean that you can't bleed like I do.
Right.
It's a matter of just coexisting with one another,
Yeah.
and respecting one another's. Like I said from the very beginning, as long as you do no harm to yourself or others. Some may argue that me having gender affirmation surgery is harming myself. That's an argument we can have. Bottom line is, though, is that I needed that just like a woman who needs breast implants because she's unhappy with her own breasts and her self-esteem is struggling because of it. And she gets the breast implants and her self-esteem is through the roof.
Yeah.
And that's what happens to many of us. I know that if you took my DNA and created another me, it wouldn't be Jessica anymore, right? So that goes to say that whatever happens to my body when it regards to surgery is technically cosmetic because, it's not in my, but that doesn't make me a nicer person. If I ended up in a horrific accident and my engulfed in flames and I was just charred and a figure of something, does that make me any less human? Does that make me that I don't feel anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Am I something other? Am I something else? No, I'm still me. I've got things that I'm struggling with now that I need your support with.
Yeah. Listen, that's a perfect place for us to close this part. We should probably have more of these discussions. I hope that in society there are a lot more, especially before voting on an issue like this. Are there any resources people can turn to that you can point them to?
Well, there's lots of resources available. I don't want to polarize. So,
Okay.
I will let you do that research, but I want you to be vigilant in finding those resources. I certainly know where I go to, and if you want to find out where I go to specifically, you could reach out to me,
Okay.
and all that. But
Through the show, we'll make sure that they get to you.
absolutely. So, just be informed, and make sure you looked at both sides of the story. So I don't only watch CNN. I'll turn on Fox too, and I'll watch Fox for a little while, and then I'll watch CNN, and then maybe I won't watch either, and I'll watch ABC News, or I'll watch, but I try to find those different perspectives because you have your perspective on how things went down. I have my perspective the way things down. Usually it's what happens somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we really need to look at.
Jessica, thank you. As usual, I told you we would run out of time like immediately. But I really want to thank you particularly for being as vulnerable as you are, not only now, but for decades. Because it's
scary
not
for me
easy
now.
to do.
I think I'm more scared now than I was in the 1980s, only because in the 1980s I was safe in my closet. I'm no longer safe in that closet. And
Yeah.
and
And
me
sadly,
coming
we're
out here-
seeing, I mean, this feels like Anita Bryant starting all over again, like.
right, and she
the
wasn't even a
beginnings.
politician. She
Right.
was just a beauty queen.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much, Jessica.
my pleasure.
And to everyone out there, thank you for joining us in the Forward Miami show. And we